Welcome, friends. Today, we are opening a new, even dustier, and more secretive archive box. Inside, we store the chronicles of great absurdity, brilliant scams, and actions driven not by logic, but by sheer stubbornness, boredom, or brilliant insanity. Prepare yourselves, for the stories you are about to hear will prove that the most unpredictable writer is human nature. If you enjoy stories in this format, support this series with a like and let us know in the comments which city you are listening from. In previous episodes, you have shown incredible engagement. Trust me, it greatly helps the development of our community. This is 30 stories that are hard to believe. Let's begin. Story number 1. The Man Who Ordered Chaos at Home. London, November 27th, 1810. Berner Street is a quiet, respectable corner of the city, inhabited by wealthy widows, doctors, and artists. The foggy morning promised nothing more than the usual routine: the clatter of hooves on the pavement, the cries of milkmen, and the smell of coal from the fireplaces. In house number 54, Mrs. Tottenham, a respectable widow, was enjoying her morning tea, completely unaware that in an hour her name would become the center of the most grandiose prank in England's history. The cause was a bet. The night before, 22-year-old writer and famous joker Theodore Hook wagered with a friend 1 guinea that he could make any house in London the most famous address in a week. The friend randomly chose house number 54. Hook didn't wait a week. He sat down at his desk and began writing. He wrote thousands of letters. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first chimney sweep arrived at Mrs. Tottenham's home. The widow politely informed him that his services were not required. While she spoke with him, a second chimney sweep arrived, and then a third. Within an hour, a line of 12 chimney sweeps had formed at her door, each claiming they had been summoned. That was just the beginning. Following that, carts piled high with coal started to arrive, then vans with furniture, then 12 pianos ordered for the living room, followed by confectioners carrying gigantic wedding cakes. Doctors, convinced that someone in the house was dying, priests rushing to administer the last rites, lawyers, undertakers, opticians, cobblers, pie merchants. The street became an impassable jam. Carts blocked one another, horses neighed, drivers shouted, merchants fought for the right to approach the door. But Theodore Hook did not stop with just the merchants. He wrote letters on behalf of Mrs. Tottenham to high-ranking officials. A carriage carrying the Lord Mayor of London arrived. Following it was the carriage of the Governor of the Bank of England, the Chairman of the East India Company, and even the coach of the Duke of York, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. They all arrived on urgent summons and became stuck in this chaos. The police were powerless. They tried to disperse the crowd, but for every cart that left, 2 new ones arrived. By evening, Berner Street painted an apocalyptic scene. Thousands of people, hundreds of carts, abandoned pianos, trampled cakes, and mountains of coal. And Theodore Hook himself rented a room in the house across the street, sat by the window with a friend, and spent the whole day laughing as he observed the man-made apocalypse he created with his pen and ink, winning a bet for 1 guinea. This man created chaos for the sake of laughter, conducting the flow of people like a maestro. But in our next story, chaos arose on its own, and its weapon was not a command, but uncontrollable laughter, which turned into an epidemic that neither doctors nor shamans could stop. Story number 2. The Laughter Epidemic That Closed Cities. Tanganyika, modern Tanzania, 1962. Imagine a quiet village called Okasha on the shores of Lake Victoria. The air is humid and thick, smelling of rain and earth. In the girls' missionary school, a lesson is underway. The monotonous voice of the teacher, the buzzing of flies, the scratching of pens on paper. An ordinary day. On January 30th, during recess, 3 students shared some joke. They began to laugh. At first, it was the usual contagious girlish laughter. But when the bell rang and the lesson resumed, the laughter did not stop. It stopped being joyful. It turned into a fit. The girls laughed, gasping, clutching their stomachs. Their faces were contorted in pain. Tears flowed down their cheeks, but they could not stop. Soon, another girl started to laugh. Then another. By the end of the day, 95 out of 159 students were convulsing with uncontrollable laughter. The teachers were in a panic. They tried to calm the girls, giving them water, but nothing helped. The fits lasted from several hours to several days. Laughter was followed by weeping, screaming, then back to hysterical laughter. Some developed rashes, others fainted from exhaustion. The school was closed, and the girls were sent home to their native villages. But it was like releasing a virus from a lab. The epidemic began to roam the country. Infected girls spread laughter to their mothers, sisters, and neighbors. Soon, entire villages were engulfed by this strange plague. People laughed in the fields, in huts, in markets. This was not laughter of joy. It was the sound of madness. Doctors could not find the cause. No bacteria, no viruses. Locals concluded it was witchcraft, a curse sent by enemies. The only way to combat the epidemic was by closing schools. A total of 14 schools were shut down, affecting more than 1,000 people. The Great Laughter epidemic lasted 18 months. It waned in one place, only to flare up in another. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it simply disappeared. Modern scientists believe it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. The stress from strict school rules, the uncertainty of the future in a newly independent country, all of this became a trigger. The minds of thousands of people found the strangest way to let off steam, turning laughter into a weapon against themselves. This laughter was a ghost, an invisible force born in the minds of people and enslaving their bodies. It proves that the most terrifying prison is our own mind. But the hero of our next story decided that the mind is a tool for building, not for imprisonment. Dissatisfied with laws and taxes, he decided to build his own country from scratch, piling it up in the middle of the ocean with a shovel and naming it a republic. This is story number 3, a republic built on sand and audacity. The South Pacific, south of Tonga, 1971. American millionaire Michael Oliver. He put it in his pocket. The next day, he found another stone, and another. In the mind of a simple postman who had never ventured beyond his canton and had no architectural education, a crazy idea was born. He decided to build the perfect palace. A palace that would combine all styles and eras of all gods and all beings he had seen in postcards and magazines delivered to his addressees. Every day, for the next 33 years, Ferdinand Cheval set out on his route with a cart. While delivering the mail, he collected stones. The locals thought he was crazy. They saw him, tired after his night shifts, mixing cement by the light of an oil lamp and laying his finds. He built alone. His palace grew slowly, like a living organism. It was not a building in the conventional sense. It was a hallucination made of stone. It featured Hindu temples, Egyptian tombs, medieval castles, Swiss chalets, and mosques. The walls were adorned with figures of octopuses, caimans, elephants, and fairies. He wove shells and glass into the stone. Cheval completed the construction in 1912, when he was 76 years old. The palace measured 26 meters in length and 10 meters in height. He wanted to be buried in his creation, like a pharaoh, but French laws prohibited burial outside of cemeteries. Cheval did not give up. At 78, he went to the local cemetery and began building again. For another 8 years, he constructed a mausoleum of silence and eternal peace in the same fantastical style. He died at 88, just a year after completing the mausoleum. His perfect palace still stands today, recognized as a masterpiece of naive architecture, a monument to the perseverance of one man who proved that a dream can be built with one's own hands, stone by stone. Cheval built to leave a mark, but the hero of our next story became famous for disappearing without leaving a trace, a name, or a parachute with which he jumped from a plane with a bag of money. Story number 5. A ghost in a business suit and $200,000. Portland, Airport, November 24, 1971, the eve of Thanksgiving. A man, about 40 years old, dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and black tie with a pearl tie clip, approaches the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. He purchases a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He pays in cash. He takes a seat in row 18 on board a Boeing 72. He orders bourbon with soda. He is polite, calm, and nothing out of the ordinary. Soon after takeoff, he hands a note to the flight attendant. The young woman, used to flirtation from passengers, pockets it without reading. "Miss, you should take a look at the note," Cooper says softly. "I have a bomb." He opens his briefcase. Inside, the flight attendant sees red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. His demands were specific and strangely modest for such a risk. $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Not 2, but 4. This led the police to believe he planned to take hostages. The plane circled Seattle while money and parachutes were collected on the ground. Cooper remained unfazed. He paid for the drinks and even insisted that the flight attendant keep the change. When the airplane landed, he released all the passengers and 2 flight attendants in exchange for money and parachutes. The pilots, the flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant remained on board. Cooper ordered them to fly to Mexico, but at minimum speed with the landing gear extended and flaps deployed, at no higher than 3,000 meters, and most importantly, with the cabin depressurized. The Boeing took off into the night. A heavy, icy rain was falling. 2 fighter jets followed the airliner, but in the darkness and clouds they lost visual contact. Somewhere over the wild forests of Washington state at 2013, a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The rear stairway had opened. Cabin pressure fluctuated. When the plane landed in Reno for refueling, the cabin was empty. DB Cooper vanished along with the money and parachutes. Only his cheap tie with a pin remained on the seat. The FBI launched the largest manhunt in its history. They combed through the forests, dredged rivers, and checked thousands of suspects, but found very little. In 1980, a boy discovered a packet of deteriorating $20 bills on the bank of the Columbia River, the serial numbers matching the ransom. Did Cooper survive? The jump at night, in the rain, in the woods, dressed in a business suit and loafers, with a training parachute that couldn't be controlled, the odds were negligible. Yet the body was never found. The case of D.B. Cooper, as the journalists mistakenly named him, remains the only unsolved airplane hijacking in the history of American aviation. Cooper stepped into the void and became a legend. But the hero of our next story stepped into the void to survive and lived where it seemed physically impossible, adrift on a piece of wreckage among sharks with only a watch that had stopped at the moment of disaster. Story number 6. The fever that made the city dance until exhaustion. Strasbourg, July 15, 18. The cobblestones were heated by the sun. In the narrow streets lined with half-timbered houses, dense, still air hung. The townsfolk hid in the shade, lazily swatting away flies. Nothing predicted that this drowsy summer day would mark the beginning of one of the strangest and most terrifying epidemics in human history. A woman named Frau Trophea stepped out of her house and into the street. She wasn't going to the market or the church. She simply stood in the middle of the street and began to dance without any music, for no reason at all. This was not a dance of joy. Her movements were sharp and jerky. Her arms flew upwards, her feet beat a feverish rhythm on the dusty stones. There was no smile on her face, just a mask of agonizing trance. Her eyes were empty, staring into nothingness. Neighbors emerged from their homes, whispering in astonishment. Children pointed. Her husband tried to lead her home, but she broke free and continued her silent, insane dance. She danced for 1 hour, then another. She danced until sunset, until she collapsed onto the cobblestones from sheer exhaustion. Her feet were worn to the bone. But the next morning, she got up and began to dance again. By the end of the week, 34 more people had joined her. Within a month, the city was engulfed in a true frenzy. Around 400 townspeople, men, women, and children, danced in the streets and squares. They could not stop. The city council was in a panic. Doctors shrugged their shoulders, guessing that it was just hot blood. Then, the magistrate made the most absurd decision imaginable. They decided that the illness needed to be danced away. The authorities cleared the city markets, built wooden platforms, and hired musicians. Drums thundered through the streets of Strasbourg, and bagpipes and flutes wailed. Healthy people played music to make the sick dance even faster. It was a grotesque carnival. Hundreds of people, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings, writhed in a feverish dance. They fell from heart attacks, exhaustion, and strokes, but others kept moving, oblivious to everything around them. The epidemic stopped as suddenly as it began, only by September, leaving the city in shock. Scientists are still debating the causes. Was it poisoning from ergot causing hallucinations, or a case of mass psychosis triggered by hunger and stress? But the fact remains, a whole city spent several weeks submerged in a dance madness that cannot be explained rationally. Strasbourg became a victim of an unexplainable human impulse, chaos born in the bodies of hundreds of people. But sometimes chaos is not an internal malfunction, but a series of external, comedic, and very dangerous mistakes. Our next story is about a ship that sailed under the flag of pure misfortune, turning every outing to sea into a catastrophe. Story number 7. The Ship of Misfortune and its Captain Optimist. The Pacific Ocean, World War II. Among hundreds of American ships battling the Japanese fleet, there was one that sailors tried to avoid. It was nicknamed Poor Willie D. Officially, it was called USS William D., a Fletcher-class destroyer. Its story is a comedy of errors that miraculously did not end in a tragedy of universal scale. November 1943. Willie D's first assignment: escort the battleship Iowa, which carried U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. He was on his way to the secret Tehran conference to meet with Stalin and Churchill. The adventures began even at the port. As it was leaving the pier, Willie D snagged the anchor of a neighboring destroyer, ripping off its mooring lines, lifeboats, and whatever was not secured. A great start. The next day, during drills, a depth charge was accidentally dropped from the ship. The explosion occurred right under the battleship Iowa. The 45,000-ton vessel was tossed so much that the president nearly fell from his stretcher seat. The security team thought it was an attack by a German submarine, and the whole convoy began anti-submarine maneuvers. But the climax happened on the third day. President Roosevelt wanted to observe torpedo drills. Willie D was supposed to launch a training torpedo at Iowa. The destroyer's captain, Wilfred Walter, known for his optimism, wanted to do it perfectly. A torpedo man accidentally forgot to remove the live charge from the torpedo launcher. The torpedo headed straight for the battleship with the president on board. Panic broke out on Willie D. They were supposed to immediately alert Iowa by radio, but the ship had orders to maintain radio silence to avoid revealing their location. The signalmen began to wave flags desperately, but confused the signals and reported that a torpedo was heading in the opposite direction. Finally, in desperation, Captain Walter broke the order and shouted into the radio, "Left, turn right! Left, turn right!" The call sign for Iowa on the battleship was heard. The massive ship began a clumsy turn. The torpedo passed just a few feet from the stern and exploded in the wake. After this incident, Willie D was removed from the assignment. For the first time in the history of the U.S. Navy, an entire ship was detained. The captain faced a court-martial, but President Roosevelt personally pardoned him, saying, "Mistakes happen." The ship was sent to the Aleutian Islands, far from important personnel. There, he managed to fire from the main caliber at the base commandant's house, mistaking it for a target. Fate caught up with poor Willie D in 1945 near Okinawa. A Japanese kamikaze missed and fell into the water next to the ship, but his bomb exploded under the keel of the destroyer, throwing it into the air. The ship sank for 3 hours. Amazingly, not a single crew member perished in this last disaster. Willie D proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the opponent, but one's own bad luck. But the hero of our next story was, on the contrary, the embodiment of fortune. He was a cat that served on 3 ships, 2 British and 1 German, and survived the sinking of each, becoming a legend of the Royal Navy. Story number 8. Unsinkable Sam. A cat with 9 lives and 3 flags. The Atlantic Ocean, World War II. Amid the roar of artillery, the wailing of sirens, and the creaking of metal from sinking ships, there was one soul that seemed to have made a personal non-aggression pact with Poseidon. It was an ordinary black and white cat. History didn't preserve his real name, but the sailors knew him as Oscar, and later as Unsinkable Sam. His odyssey began aboard the German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine. On May 27, 1941, after a furious hunt, the British fleet caught up with and sank Bismarck. Out of 2,200 crew members, only 114 survived. When the British destroyer Cossack rescued the survivors, the sailors saw something strange. On a piece of floating wreckage amidst oil patches and cold waves sat a calm, black and white cat. He was wet, angry, but completely unharmed. The British, abiding by an unwritten sea law stating that a cat should not be abandoned, brought him aboard. They named him Oscar. Thus, a Nazi cat became a British cat. Oscar served on Cossack for several months, diligently catching flies and winning the crew's affection. But on October 24th of that same year, Cossack, escorting a convoy from Gibraltar, was torpedoed by a German submarine. The explosion ripped the bow off the ship. 159 sailors died. The ship sank. The crew was evacuated to the destroyer Legion. And again, amidst the chaos, someone remembered Oscar. They found him calm as Buddha on a piece of wood and transferred him to Legion. Cossack sank. After this incident, it seemed that the cat had been promoted in rank. He was reassigned to serve on the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, which played a key role in sinking his first home, the Bismarck. The irony of fate is worthy of a playwright. On the Ark Royal, the cat received a new nickname, Unsinkable Sam. However, a curse, or a lucky charm, depending on how you look at it, followed him closely. On the 14th of November 1941, while returning from Malta, the Ark Royal was torpedoed. The aircraft carrier sank slowly, allowing almost the entire crew to escape. When it was time to abandon ship, one of the officers in the lifeboat spotted Sam, floating on a piece of wreckage, angry but completely unharmed. After the loss of 3 ships in 6 months, the British Admiralty decided enough was enough. Sam was reassigned to shore. He was appointed as the chief mouser at the Governor-General's residence in Gibraltar and later transferred to a sailor's home in Belfast, where he lived a long and peaceful life until 1955. His pastel portrait still hangs in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Unsinkable Sam, the cat who served under 2 warring flags and outlived all his captains, became an immortal symbol of maritime luck and resilience. Sam survived at sea, but the hero of our next story survived on land, in the very heart of the enemy capital. He was an American soldier who escaped captivity and hid in Berlin, working on the railroad and even dating the daughter of a German official while the Red Army stormed the city. Story number 9. The soldier who switched armies in the midst of the Battle of Berlin. Joseph Beerley was a man born for trouble. In 1944, he was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States, the famous Screaming Eagles. He was parachuted over Normandy just hours before D-Day. He blew up power stations, was captured, escaped, and was captured again. The Germans found him too American, audacious, resilient, and constantly looking for a way to flee. After several failed attempts, he was sent to a POW camp, Stalag 3 CMS, in eastern Germany, near the Polish border. In January 1945, as the roar of Soviet artillery was already echoing from the east, Joe and 2 of his comrades escaped once more. They split up. Joe, following the sound of cannon fire, headed east toward the Russians. He hoped to find Soviet troops and join them. For several weeks he wandered through freezing forests, surviving on whatever he could find. One morning, he stepped into a clearing and saw what he had been looking for. In front of him stood a Soviet T-34 tank with a white star on its armor. Joe emerged from the woods with his hands raised, shouting the only phrase he knew in Russian, "I am an American comrade." The tank crew initially wanted to shoot him, mistaking him for a German spy. But Joe was lucky. The battalion commander turned out to be a woman. She did not speak English, but she had a political officer who knew a little of the language. Using gestures and broken Russian and English, Joe explained who he was and that he wanted to fight with them against the Nazis. The Soviet woman major, impressed by his story and audacity, laughed and enlisted him in her battalion. So, Joseph Burley, a sergeant in the United States Army, became a machine gunner in a Soviet tank battalion. For the next month, he fought alongside the Red Army. He participated in the liberation of the very camp from which he had escaped and took pleasure in seeing the shocked faces of the former guards. In February, his battalion came under bombardment. Joe was severely wounded and evacuated to a Soviet hospital. There, fate took another incredible turn. Marshal Georgy Zhukov visited the hospital for an inspection. Upon learning that the only American soldier fighting in the Red Army was in the ward, Zhukov personally came to see him. He was so impressed by Burley's story that he provided him with official documents and an order mandating all Soviet authorities to assist the American comrade in returning home. With these papers, Joseph Burley made it to Moscow. He arrived at the American embassy, where he was initially arrested as a deserter or spy. No one could believe that an American sergeant, officially listed as killed in action in Normandy, could appear in Moscow dressed as a Soviet soldier. Only after his fingerprints were checked was his identity confirmed. He returned to the United States, got married, became a father, and lived a long life. His son John Burley later became the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Joseph Burley is the only soldier in history to have officially fought for both the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II. While Joseph Burley fought in a tank, the heroine of our next story waged her war on the stage. She was an opera singer who used her voice not for arias, but to save people, hiding them in dressing rooms and secretly smuggling them across borders right under the noses of the Nazis. Story number 10. The Valkyrie who sang for kings and hid fugitives. Australia, the 1930s. Marjorie Lawrence was not just an opera singer. She was a force of nature, a powerful soprano capable of drowning out an orchestra. With an athletic build, she would leap onto a horse in the death scene of Wagner's operas, something no diva had done before her, and a spirit that did not know the word no. She conquered the Paris Opera, the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and sang for King George VI. But in 1941, during the height of her fame, her world collapsed. While rehearsing in Mexico, she felt weakness in her legs. Within a few days, she was paralyzed from the waist down. The diagnosis? Polio. For an opera singer whose job is to stand on stage, this was a death sentence for her career. Doctors told her that she would never walk again. Marjorie spent a year in despair, but then her Australian spirit took over. She said, "If I can't stand, I will sing while sitting." She developed a system of exercises, strengthened her back and diaphragm muscles to such an extent that she could hit notes while sitting in a wheelchair with the same power as before. In 1942, she returned to the stage of the Metropolitan Opera in the role of Isolde. When the curtain rose and the audience saw her in a chair, the hall fell silent, and then she began to sing. It was one of the greatest triumphs in opera history, but that is not the main story. The main events happened during the war. Marjorie, being an Australian citizen, could freely move across occupied Europe. She gave concerts for German officers who adored her Wagnerian repertoire. They applauded her, unaware that behind the scenes, her performance space had become a transit point for the resistance movement. She used her status as an untouchable star to hide downed Allied pilots, Jewish children, and members of the resistance. In her home outside Paris, there was a secret basement where people awaited transport to safety. She carried coded messages within musical scores. The boldest trick she pulled off was at the border with Spain. Her vehicle was stopped by a German patrol. An officer began to ask questions. Under the blankets in the car, a family of Jewish refugees was hiding. Any unexpected noise could lead to execution for all of them. Marjorie, sitting in her chair, smiled at the officer and began to sing. She performed the aria of Brunhilde, loudly, so loudly that the windows of the car trembled. The astonished officer, who might have heard her in Paris, saluted and waved his hand. "Proceed, madam." Marjorie Lawrence, the sitting Valkyrie, not only overcame illness but also waged her quiet war, using her voice as both weapon and shield. Marjorie saved lives through her art, but the hero of our next story saved art through audacity. He was the curator of the Louvre, who single-handedly organized the evacuation of the Mona Lisa and thousands of other masterpieces right under the noses of advancing Nazis, hiding them in castles across France. Story number 11. The Man Who Stole the Louvre from Hitler. Paris, late August 1939. The air is thick with fear. Everyone understands that war is inevitable. In the offices of the Louvre, there is a silence, but it is the calm before the storm. Deputy Director Jacques Jajard gazes at the masterpieces he has sworn to protect: the Mona Lisa, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, the Venus de Milo. He knows that Hitler and Goering are avid collectors, and that in case of occupation, they would take everything. On August 25th, Jajard makes a decision. He announces the closure of the Louvre for 3 days due to renovation work. It's a lie. That very night begins the most extensive and secret operation to save art in history. Hundreds of museum staff, curators, restorers, and ordinary workers start the evacuation. It is a logistical nightmare. 3,693 works of art. Huge canvases by Rubens and Veronese were rolled up and stored in giant cylinders. The Mona Lisa, too fragile to transport, was packed in a special box with triple protection. The box was marked with the code MN00001 and a warning about its fragility in red letters. The gigantic statue, known as the Winged Victory of Samothrace, weighing several tons, was lowered down the main staircase on wooden ramps. This took several hours. 203 trucks, including ambulances, taxis, and vans for transporting decorations, lined up in a convoy. By nightfall, without lights, the convoy left Paris. The destinations were dozens of castles and abbeys throughout France, which Jajard had pre-selected as secret storages. When, a few days later, German troops entered Paris, the officer responsible for the protection of the artwork, Count Franz von Wolfdeny, who ironically was a secret anti-fascist, walked into the Louvre. The halls were empty, and only empty frames hung on the walls. "Where are the paintings?" he asked. Jacques Jajard, who remained in Paris, shrugged helplessly about the restoration. Over the next 4 years, Jajard's team, referred to as the Monuments, waged their quiet war. They constantly moved treasures from one castle to another, staying one step ahead of the Gestapo and the SS art squads. The Mona Lisa changed her hiding place 6 times during the war. Once, a truck transporting valuable artworks broke down in the middle of the road. Local residents helped repair it, unaware of the precious cargo they were saving. Jacques Jajard, a modest clerk, pulled off the heist of the century. He deceived the entire leadership of the Third Reich. Thanks to him, after the war, nearly all the treasures of the Louvre returned to their places, whole and unharmed. Jajard saved the paintings. And the hero of our next story saved the city. He was a simple plumber who single-handedly stopped a monstrous fire that threatened to destroy London, using only a wrench and his knowledge of underground utilities. Story number 12. The Plumber Who Extinguished the Great London Fire. London, the night of December 29, 1940. Hundreds of German incendiary bombs rained down on the city. It was the most terrifying night of the London Blitz, later referred to as the Second Great Fire of London. The business district of the city had turned into a hell of flames. Fire crews were powerless. Glass melted, stone walls crumbled. But the biggest problem was water. The Thames River was at low tide, and the aging Victorian water pipes couldn't withstand the pressure and burst one after another. Firefighter pumps were sucking air. In the middle of this apocalypse, underground, in the labyrinth of pipes and valves, there was one man. His name was Francis Tibbets. He was neither a firefighter nor a soldier. He was an inspector of the London water supply. In simpler terms, a plumber. Tibbets and his small team received orders to ensure, at all costs, a water supply to the area around St. Paul's Cathedral. This cathedral, a creation of Christopher Wren, was a symbol of the indomitability of the British spirit. Losing it would strike the nation harder than the loss of an army. Tibbets knew underground London better than his own apartment. He was familiar with the location of every valve, every shutoff, every backup main. When the main pipe supplying the city burst, Tibbets didn't panic. He descended into the sewer. Bombs were falling around him. The ground shook. Above, through the grates of the hatches, the blood-red sky was visible. Water in the tunnel began to rise, threatening to flood him. By touch, in the darkness and from memory, he began his work. He isolated the damaged sections, opened up bypasses, and connected mains that hadn't been used in decades. He played the water system of London like an organ, redirecting precious streams of water to the fire pumps that were already starting to choke. It was a race against time. Several times he was nearly crushed by the collapsing walls. One of his assistants lost his life. But Francis continued to turn the valves. Thanks to him, firefighters were able to protect St. Paul's Cathedral. Its dome, surrounded by a sea of fire, became a symbol of hope for the entire world. The famous photograph titled "St. Paul Survives," taken that night, made headlines in all the newspapers. But no one knew that behind this photograph was an unnamed plumber crawling on his knees through water underground. Francis Tibbets did not receive any medals. His name did not appear in any textbooks. He simply returned home, drank tea, and went back to work the next day. Tibbets saved the city, but the hero of our next story saved something more fragile: hope. He was a clown who performed in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, making children who were heading to their deaths laugh, proving that laughter could be an act of resistance. Story number 13. A cabaret on the brink of hell. Imagine a city that does not appear on any map. A city built of lies. Behind the walls of the old fortress Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia in 1944, the Nazis created their most cynical masterpiece, an exemplary ghetto. Here, to distract the Red Cross, they simulated normal life. There were cafes, a theater, and even a jazz orchestra. And this theater had its own director. His name was Kurt Gehren. Before the war, he was the king of the Berlin Bohemia. Large and charismatic, he appeared in films with Marlene Dietrich and sang in Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera. He was a star. But now, he was prisoner number such and such. But the Nazis decided to use his talent. The camp commandant ordered Gehren to create a cabaret to entertain the prisoners. Thus, the cabaret carousel was born. Every week, in a dusty barrack on an improvised stage, Kurt Gehren and other performers and prisoners put on shows. They sang songs about pre-war Paris, read poetry, and performed funny skits. And the audience, 150,000 Jews, weakened by hunger, typhus, and fear, laughed. It was the strangest laughter on earth. Laughter was an act of resistance. They laughed at soup made from potato peels. They applauded, knowing that tomorrow their names might appear on a list for deportation to Auschwitz. In this city of lies, laughter was the only truth, the only currency that could not be taken away. The climax of this theater of absurdity came with an order to shoot a propaganda film titled "The Führer Gifts the Jews a City." Gehren, the great director, was forced to film how happily the Jews lived under the protection of the Third Reich. It was the most surreal footage in the history of cinema. People were better fed for several days so they wouldn't look like skeletons. Empty stores were stocked with goods that were taken away after the command, "Cut." Children were forced to smile while eating oranges they had seen for the first time in their lives. The orchestra played Mozart against the backdrop of freshly painted facades. Kurt Gehren stood behind the camera, creating the greatest lie, hoping that this work would save his life. The film was completed. It turned out to be convincing. A delegation from the Red Cross left satisfied, and just a few days after shooting, Kurt Gehren and all the actors, including the children from the film, were loaded onto freight cars. The last train from Theresienstadt carried them to Auschwitz. Kurt Girona and his wife were sent to the gas chamber immediately upon arrival. He died on the 28th of October, 1944. The next day, Himmler ordered all gas chambers to cease operations. The director, who gave his comrades one last laugh, missed his chance for salvation by 24 hours. Giron used art as a shield in a world where the truth was a crime. But in our next story, a simple piece of art became a weapon. A melody broadcast over the radio turned into a signal for revolution, proving that a song can be louder than 1,000 cannons. Story number 14. The song that overthrew a dictatorship. Portugal. The night of the 24th of April, 1974. The country is frozen in time. For almost half a century, it has been under the authority of a new state, the longest fascist regime in Europe. Censorship, secret police, PIDE, colonial wars in Africa, poverty. People are afraid to speak even in whispers in their kitchens. But in the barracks, a conspiracy is brewing. A group of young officers, tired of a senseless war, decide to overthrow the dictatorship. They call themselves the Movement of the Captains. They have a plan. But how to give the order to an entire army scattered across the country without arousing suspicion from the secret police? The phones are tapped, and couriers are unreliable. They need a signal that everyone will hear, but only those who should understand will grasp. They choose the most innocent and most powerful weapon, music. On the 24th of April, at 10:55 p.m., the song E Depois do Adeus plays on the national radio. This song represented Portugal at Eurovision. A sweet, sentimental ballad about love. For millions of Portuguese, just another hit. For the conspirators, the first signal. The operation begins. Be ready. The second decisive signal must sound after midnight. This is the song Grândola Vila Morena, a song by a rebellious communist poet, forbidden by the regime. At 12:20 a.m., the announcer of Radio Renascença says, "In a few moments, the song I received from friends will play." He reads the first lines and plays the record. Across the country, in barracks, homes, and taverns, hundreds of officers, leaning into their radios, hear a raspy male voice singing about brotherhood and freedom. This was the password. Tanks roll into the streets of Lisbon. Soldiers occupy government buildings, airports, and radio stations. This is the strangest revolution in history. It takes place with almost no shots fired. In the morning, when citizens take to the streets and see tanks, they do not flee in fear. They approach the soldiers and begin to stuff flowers, carnations, into the barrels of rifles and machine guns. Red carnations that, on that day, the vendor Celeste Cairo handed out to everyone who wanted them. By evening, Lisbon is awash in flowers. Soldiers and civilians embrace on the tank's armor. The dictator Marcelo Caetano surrenders. A 48-year-long dictatorship collapses in a single day to the sounds of a song. This revolution was marked in history as the Carnation Revolution. It proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is not steel, but a melody that unites hearts. Music changed the fate of the country. But in our next story, an ordinary deck of playing cards changed the fate of American prisoners of war in Vietnam. It became not just a source of entertainment, but also a secret code that helped them survive and outsmart their captors. Story number 15. The Card House That Stood Against Torture. Vietnam. The Hanoi Hilton POW Camp, 1967. American pilot James Robinson Robbie Risner sits in a solitary confinement cell. Isolation is one of the cruelest forms of torture. Prisoners are forbidden to communicate. Any conversation, any knock, any glance is punished with beatings. The captors aim to break their spirits, to turn officers into terrified loners. However, Reisner and other prisoners find a way to break the silence. They revive an old prison telegraph. The code is based on a 5x5 matrix where each letter corresponds to 2 knocks. The first knock indicates the row number, and the second indicates the column number. They knock on the walls, cough, and sweep the floor in a specific rhythm. This is how they share news, support each other, and coordinate their resistance. But this code is slow and risky. One day, during an interrogation, one prisoner spots a deck of playing cards on the desk of a Vietnamese officer, and an idea is born. When he is returned to his cell, he starts tapping on the wall. He has created a new card code. Each card represents a letter or a phrase. Ace of Hearts, hello. King of Spades, Commander wounded. Thus, the card code system was born. They had no real cards. The entire deck of 52 cards existed only in their minds. Each prisoner had to memorize it. The code was brilliant in its simplicity and secrecy. Instead of tapping out long sequences, they could simply cough, sneeze, or drop a bowl in a specific way, imitating the sound of a card falling on a table. A short cough for hearts, a dull thud for spades, a scraping sound for diamonds, and a drawn-out sigh for clubs. This code became their salvation. They could communicate in plain sight of the guards who did not understand what was happening. They organized protests, warned each other about traitors, and passed along information about new prisoners. They even played bridge, passing cards to each other through coughs. The cards became a symbol of their unity. When one of the prisoners, Lieutenant Mike Christian, was caught sewing an American flag onto the lining of his shirt, he was brutally beaten. After returning to his cell, he could hardly move. But the next day, he started sewing again. When asked via the telegraph why he was risking it, he replied, "So we would have a flag for morning roll call." The deck of cards that did not exist helped these people maintain their sanity, honor, and lives. It transformed a crowd of broken individuals into a brotherhood that could not be defeated by torture or years of isolation. The cards saved lives, but in our next story, life was saved by an ordinary bee, or rather, millions of bees that became unexpected allies in one of the strangest battles of World War I. Story number 16, The Battle of the Bees, or the Sweetest Truce. East Africa, November 1914. World War I reached even this exotic corner of the planet. British colonial troops attempted to capture the port of Tonga, which was held by German Askari soldiers, led by the legendary Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. The British were confident of a swift victory, boasting numerical superiority. However, they overlooked two crucial factors: the genius of Lettow-Vorbeck and the presence of local residents with wings. The British landing party set ashore and began their advance. The Germans and Askari, concealed in the underbrush, met them with a torrential fire. The attack faltered. The next day, the British decided to outflank the enemy's positions through the thick undergrowth. Soldiers, suffering from the heat and insect bites, pushed through the jungle. Suddenly, they heard a growing hum. At first, they thought it was airplanes, but the sound was different. Lower, vibrating, alive. They had disturbed the hives of wild African bees. These were not ordinary honeybees. They were aggressive, deadly insects whose stings could cause anaphylactic shock. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of enraged bees swarmed over the British detachment. In a panic, the soldiers dropped their rifles and machine guns and fled, rushing back toward the shore, desperately swatting at the buzzing cloud. They dove into the ocean to escape, but the bees pursued them. The Germans, observing the scene from their trenches, were initially stunned but then began to laugh. Their opponent, the mighty British Army, had been routed by a swarm of insects. The bee attack completely demoralized the British forces. Soldiers refused to return to the jungle. Many suffered severe swelling. Some died from stings. Command, realizing that morale had collapsed, ordered a retreat. The battle for Tonga, later dubbed the Battle of the Bees, ended in a humiliating defeat for the British. Colonel Lettow-Vorbeck, a man with a sense of humor, modestly noted in his report that the enemy's main forces were scattered by our smallest, yet most numerous allies. The bees had halted the army, but in our next story, a single man would stop an army. He was a farmer who refused to sell his land for airport construction and lived for 30 years in a small house surrounded by runways. Story number 17, The Farmer Who Lived in the Middle of the Runway. Japan, Chiba Prefecture, the late 60s. The government decided to build a new international airport, Narita, to relieve Tokyo's congestion. The plan was grand, but there was one problem. The land belonged to farmers who had cultivated rice and vegetables here for generations. The government began forcibly purchasing the plots. Most farmers, having received compensation, surrendered. But not all. A few families, led by a man named Takao Shido, refused to leave. For them, It was not just land, it was their ancestors' land, their history, their lives. They began to fight back. Protests, clashes with the police, barricades. This was a real war that lasted for years, but the government remained unyielding. The airport was built around defiant farms. Bulldozers demolished neighbors' houses and poured concrete over fields. The farm of Shita Takao found itself gradually surrounded, like an island, amid this gigantic construction site. In 1978, Narita Airport opened, but it was not what had been planned. Right in the middle of the airport grounds, between taxiways and the future runway, a few farms remained. Shita and his neighbors continued to live there. Imagine this scene: giant Boeing 747s, roaring with engines, taxiing just a few dozen meters away from cabbage patches. Shita would step outside in the morning to water his vegetables while planes took off and landed right overhead, carrying thousands of people to different corners of the world. His life had turned into a surreal spectacle. To get home, he had to go through a checkpoint and show his documents. At night, his house was lit up by the runway lights. The noise was deafening, but he got used to it. Years went by. Other farmers surrendered and sold their land, but Shita remained the last. His small house and patch of land became a symbol of resistance. He lived there until 2020. For more than half a century, he waged his quiet war. He did not win, as the airport operates, but he did not lose either. He made a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and an entire government recognized the rights of one small man. In the end, the authorities reached a compromise, delaying expansion plans and leaving his farm in peace. Takao proved that the strongest foundation is not concrete, but stubbornness. But the hero of our next story built his foundation not on land, but on water. He was a carpenter who saved hundreds of animals during a flood by building an ark based on the biblical story, a project that initially drew laughter. This is story number 18, the ark that the dreamer carpenter built. The Netherlands, a country reclaimed from the sea, where dikes and canals are part of the national character. Johan Huybers, a successful construction contractor, lived an ordinary life until one night he had a dream. He dreamt that his native province of North Brabant was engulfed by a massive flood. The dream was so vivid and terrifying that Johan took it as a divine sign. He opened the Bible, found the chapter about Noah's Ark, and decided, "I must build one just like it." His wife Bianca thought he had lost his mind. "An ark?" she said. "You can't even swim." Neighbors shook their heads, but Johan was a man of action. In 1992, he began building his first ark. It was half the size of the biblical one, yet still huge. He constructed it in his garden, and soon the bow of the ship began to loom over the neighbor's house. 13 years later, in 2005, the ark was ready. He launched it, but immediately sold it, realizing he had not built the right one. It was a children's ark. He needed a real, full-sized one. In 2009, he started again. This time, it was for real. He hired a team of amateur carpenters and volunteers, and used Scandinavian pine, as he believed Noah would have done. The dimensions were taken directly from the Bible: 300 cubits in length, 50 in width, and 30 in height. It resulted in a ship that is 130 meters long, as tall as a 5-story building. In 2012, Johan's ark was completed. However, an empty ark is just a ship. Johan filled it with animals. Of course, not every creature came in pairs, but with life-size plastic models: elephants, giraffes, lions, crocodiles, as well as a few live animals: ponies, goats, peacocks, and parrots. The ark became a tourist attraction. Thousands of people came to see the creation of the Dutch eccentric, and in January 2018, Johan's dream nearly became a reality. A powerful storm hit the Netherlands. The wind was so strong that it tore several pontoons from the dock to which the ark was moored. The enormous vessel drifted, colliding with other ships in the port. Fortunately, there were no serious damages, but Johan Huybers, a man who was considered insane, proved that sometimes the most outlandish dreams can serve as the most reliable defense against reality. Johan built the ark to escape from the water. In contrast, the hero of our next story submerged into the water to save others. He was a doctor who invented the first submarine in the world capable of rescuing crews from sunken submarines, and he himself was the first to test it. Story number 19. The inventor who rode along the seabed on a submarine bicycle. The late 19th century. The world is gripped by an invention fever. Thomas Edison lights up the electric bulb. Carl Benz builds the first automobile. Meanwhile, a young American named Simon Lake, inspired by Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, dreams of something different, conquering the ocean depths. But Lake is not just a dreamer. He is a brilliant engineer. In 1994, he constructs his first submarine, Argonaut Jr. It looks like a triangular box made of pine boards and covered with tarpaulin. It moves with manual cranks, like a bicycle. Most importantly, it has wheels. Lake believed that the future of the submarine fleet lay not in swimming like a fish, but in traveling along the seabed like a car. During the summer of that same year, he launches his underwater cart into the river. He travels along the bottom for several miles, breathing through a pipe that reaches the surface. People laugh at him. Newspapers call him the mud turtle, but Lake does not give up. In 1997, he builds Argonaut 1, a real 36-foot steel submarine. It has a gasoline engine for surface travel and an electric motor for underwater navigation, and it has wheels. Another revolutionary feature is the lock chamber. This was a compartment from which a diver could exit directly onto the seabed without flooding the vessel. In the winter of 1998, during a terrible storm, the Argonaut gets into trouble. The boat is thrown onto the shore. Everyone is convinced it is wrecked, but Lake and his crew repair the vessel overnight, push it back into the water, and set off on the first long-distance journey in history aboard a submarine. They travel 2,000 miles across open sea from Norfolk to New York. During this journey, Lake accomplishes feats that astonish the imagination. He descends to the bottom of Chesapeake Bay, emerges through a lock, and collects oysters. Then he calls to the surface, using the world's first underwater telephone, and announces, "Dinner is ready!" Simon Lake never received recognition from the United States Navy, which placed its bets on the torpedo boats of his competitor, John Holland. However, it was his invention, the lock chamber, the periscope, and the ballast tanks, that laid the foundation for all modern submarines. He was a man who was 100 years ahead of his time, a genius who not only dreamed of Captain Nemo's world, but built it with his own hands. Lake conquered the depths, but the hero of our next story conquered the heights. He was a priest who built a flying machine from silk and whalebone and accomplished the world's first successful parachute jump by leaping from a balloon at a height of 1,000 meters. Story number 20. The Heavenly Umbrella and the First Leap into the Unknown. Paris, October 22, 1797. A huge crowd gathered over the Manceau Park. Aristocrats, onlookers, scientists, everyone looks to the sky. There, at an altitude of nearly 1,000 meters, hangs a hydrogen balloon. Beneath it, in a woven basket, stands a man. His name is André-Jacques Garnerin. He does not plan to simply fly. He plans to fall. Garnerin is a student of the famous Professor Charles, the inventor of the hydrogen aerostat. During the French Revolution, he was captured by riflemen and spent 3 years in a Hungarian fortress. It was there, in his cell, gazing out a tiny window at the sky, that he devised a way to escape, to jump from the fortress wall using a giant umbrella. The escape failed, but the idea remained. Returning to Paris, Garnerin decided to perfect it. He created the world's first reusable parachute. It was a silk canopy with a diameter of 7 meters, without a hole in the center, featuring 36 straps attached to the basket. No one knew if it would work. Physicists predicted that Garnerin would either be torn to pieces by the speed or suffocate in the thin air. And there he is, in the sky. He waves to the crowd, cuts the rope connecting the basket to the balloon, and steps into the abyss. For the first few seconds, he falls like a stone. The crowd gasps in horror. Women faint. It seems like a suicide. But then, the silk canopy fills with air and the fall slows. But now a new problem arises that Garnerin did not foresee. The air trapped under the canopy, with no escape, begins to shake the parachute. The basket sways violently from side to side. Goneran feels nauseous. He can barely stay on his feet. He resembles a pendulum of a giant clock racing toward the ground. But he continues to descend. A few minutes later, he lands softly in the park, half a kilometer from the launch site. The crowd rushes to him, lifts him up, and carries him like a hero. He is pale. He feels sick, but he is alive. He accomplished the first successful high-altitude parachute jump in history. Later, the scientist Jerome Lalonde will advise him to create a small hole in the center of the canopy to stabilize the descent. Goneran will heed the advice, and the parachute will take the shape that we recognize today. André-Jacques Goneran opened up a path for humanity, not just upward, but downward as well. He proved that even from the most hopeless situation, from a fall into the abyss, one can find a way out, if you have a silk umbrella and a drop of reckless courage. Goneran jumped from the sky, but the hero of our next story jumped into the fire. He was a photographer who captured the eruption of Mount St. Helens from a few kilometers away and left behind a film that recorded his final moments. This is story number 21, the photographer who filmed his own death. State of Washington, May 18, 1980. Mount St. Helens, which had been dormant for 123 years, was preparing for awakening. Dozens of scientists and enthusiast photographers flocked to the area to capture the rare spectacle. Among them was 48-year-old Robert Landsberg. He set up camp on a ridge just 7 kilometers from the summit. This was dangerously close, but Landsberg was obsessed with the idea of getting the perfect shot. At 8:32 in the morning, the earth shook from an earthquake. The northern slope of the volcano collapsed, triggering the largest landslide in recorded history. And then, instead of erupting upward as usual, a monstrous explosion occurred sideways. A gigantic cloud of searing gas, ash, and rocks, a pyroclastic flow, erupted from the crater at speeds exceeding the speed of sound. It was heading straight for Landsberg's camp. Robert realized he had no chance. He couldn't run, and he couldn't drive away. His car was too far. He had mere seconds. Most people in such a situation would have panicked. But Robert Landsberg was a photographer to the bone. He kept shooting. He aimed his camera at the wall of death heading toward him and pressed the shutter as long as he could. When the cloud was almost upon him, he did the last thing he could do for the story. He rewound the film back into the cassette, placed the cassette in his backpack, put the backpack on the car seat, and then lay on top of the backpack, covering it with his body. 17 days later, when rescuers reached his camp, they found a melted van and Robert Landsberg's body under a layer of ash. Underneath him, in the backpack, the cassette with the film was intact. The film was developed. The last frames he captured turned out to be invaluable for science. They vividly recorded the dynamics of the lateral eruption, allowing scientists to better understand this deadly phenomenon. Robert Landsberg did not just perish. He left behind a testament written in light on celluloid. He used his body as a shield to save information that was more important to him than life itself. Landsberg left behind a film, but the heroine of our next story left behind a mystery. She was a female pilot who set all records. Yet she disappeared in the Pacific Ocean, leaving behind only a few cryptic radio messages that continue to intrigue researchers to this day. This is story number 22, The Last Flight of Lady Lindy. The Pacific Ocean, July 2, 1937. A silver twin-engine Lockheed Electra flies over the endless blue. At the controls is Amelia Earhart, the most famous female pilot in the world. Next to her is navigator Fred Noonan. They are making a round-the-world flight along the equator. They have already covered 35,000 kilometers. The most difficult and dangerous part remains. The flight from New Guinea to the tiny atoll of Helend, a flat piece of land measuring 2 kilometers in the midst of the largest ocean on the planet. A U.S. Coast Guard ship and Tasca are waiting for them at Helend. Its mission is to serve as a radio beacon. The communication is unstable. Amelia reports that the weather is good, but the cloud cover prevents them from determining their exact location by the stars. Noonan, an experienced navigator, is forced to rely on dead reckoning. The method is imprecise and risky. At 7:42 in the morning, Tasca catches a message from Amelia. Her voice is tired, yet calm. We should be right above you, but we don't see you. Fuel is running low. Panic ensues on Itasca. They crank the boilers to full power to send up a plume of black smoke visible from the air. The radio operators desperately call for her, but only hear crackling static. 8:43. The last message from Amelia comes through. Her voice is now on the verge of hysteria. We are flying on line 15737. We repeat, we are flying. And silence. Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan, and their Lockheed Electra have vanished. The largest search operation in U.S. Navy history commenced. 66 aircraft and 9 ships scoured 250,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. No oil slick, no wreckage, no life raft. What happened to Lady Lindy, as the press called her? Theories abound. Officially, they ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. Conspiratorial, they were American spies. They were captured by the Japanese and executed. Romantic, they landed on a deserted island and lived like Robinsons. In recent years, a new and most plausible theory has emerged. On Natu Lake Kumaro, a few hundred miles from Halend, remnants of a campfire, animal and bird bones, a broken can of Freckles cream used by Amelia, and a piece of aluminum, possibly from her plane, were found. They likely made an emergency landing on the reef and then lived on the island, signaling passing aircraft until they died of hunger and thirst. Their final resting place became the very ocean that made them famous. Amelia Earhart did not reach her destination, but her mysterious disappearance transformed her from heroine to legend, an eternal symbol of courage and the mystery held by the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Amelia vanished into the sky, but the hero of our next story disappeared on land. He was the Prime Minister of Australia, who went for a swim and simply did not return, giving rise to the strangest national joke and conspiracy theory. Story number 23. The Prime Minister taken by the sea. Australia, Victoria, December 17, 1967. A hot summer day. The Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, an energetic 59-year-old lover of underwater diving, is relaxing at his beach house. Together with friends, he heads to Cheviot Beach, his favorite swimming spot. The sea that day is restless. The waves are high, and the current is strong. Holt's friends, looking at the raging water, decide not to take any risks. But the Prime Minister, known for his love of risk and excellent physical condition, just laughs. "I know this place like the back of my hand," he says as he steps into the water. He swims. His friends watch him from the shore. Suddenly, they see his figure disappear beneath the water. They wait for him to surface. 1 second. 2. 10. He doesn't reappear. Panic sets in. They call the police. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, the largest search and rescue operation in Australian history unfolds. A fleet, aviation, and hundreds of volunteers comb through every meter of the coastline. They find nothing. Not a body, not even a scrap of swimwear. The Prime Minister of Australia has simply vanished. The country is in shock. How could the head of state go missing? The official version is an accident. Holt overestimated his abilities, was swept away by the current, and drowned. But the absence of a body gave rise to an avalanche of unbelievable rumors and conspiracy theories. The most popular was that Holt was a Chinese spy. He did not drown, but was picked up by a Chinese submarine, which was waiting for him in the bay. This theory became so popular that Australians even coined an ironic phrase, to pull a Harold Holt, meaning to disappear, to run away. Others claimed he was kidnapped by the CIA because he wanted to pull Australian troops out of Vietnam. Yet another theory suggested he staged his own death to run away with his mistress. The truth is likely much simpler and more tragic, but the mystery remains. In the city of Melbourne, a swimming center was named in his honor. Australians, with their unique dark humor, considered this the best tribute to a man who loved the water so much that he stayed in it forever. Harold Holt disappeared, but the heroes of our next story, on the other hand, emerged from nowhere. They were 2 children with strange skin and an even stranger language, who came out of a wolf pit in medieval England and became a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Story number 24. The Green Children from the Earth. England, Suffolk County, the village of Woolpit, the 11th century, during the reign of King Stephen. Imagine a hot August day. It is harvest time. The peasants working in the fields suddenly freeze. Strange sounds, resembling cries, emerge from one of the wolf pits, deep traps for predators. They approach the pit and see something incredible. At the bottom stand two children, a boy and a girl. They are dressed in strange clothes made of an unfamiliar fabric, but the most astounding thing is their skin. It is distinctly green. The children speak a language that no one can understand. They are frightened and crying. The peasants pull them out of the pit and take them to the village, to the house of the local landowner, Sir Richard Declan. They are offered food, but they refuse everything until fresh green beans are brought to them. They eat them with great eagerness. The younger boy soon falls ill and dies, but the girl survives. Gradually, the green tint of her skin fades, and she begins to look like an ordinary child. She is baptized and given the name Agnes. She learns to speak English, and then she tells her story. She says that she and her brother came from the land of Saint Martin. It is a place where twilight always reigns, and all the inhabitants are green. Once they were tending their father's flock when they heard a loud sound reminiscent of the ringing of bells. They followed the sound, entered a cave, and walked for a long time through a dark tunnel. When they emerged into the light, they found themselves in a wolf pit, blinded by the bright sun they had never seen before. What was it? This story, recorded by two chroniclers of that time, became one of the most enduring mysteries of English folklore. The rational version claims they were children of Flemish immigrants who got lost. The green color of their skin might have been caused by chlorosis, a disease from malnutrition, and the strange language could have been a Flemish dialect. The fantastic version suggests they were aliens from another dimension, or the underground world who accidentally entered our reality. The folkloric version tells of fairies or elves, nature spirits. We may never know the truth. Agnes grew up, married, and according to some accounts became quite promiscuous and audacious. Her trail vanishes in history. Yet the legend of the Green Children of Woolpit remains, reminding us that sometimes reality presents us with plots that defy any explanation. The Green Children came from another world, but the hero of our next story attempted to create another world himself. He was a doctor who purchased an uninhabited island and settled there with a wife he fashioned from wax, and hundreds of dolls hung from the trees. Story number 25. The Island of the Dead Dolls and Its Mad King. Florida Keys, the early 20th century. Karl Tanzler, also known as Count Karl von Kossel, was a German radiologist working at the Naval Hospital in Key West. He was an eccentric man, obsessed with visions. Since childhood, the spirit of his great-grandmother, Countess Anna Constance von Kossel, had appeared to him, showing him the face of his one destined true love. In 1930, a 22-year-old Cuban-American beauty named Elena Milagro de Hoyos was admitted to his hospital. She was dying of tuberculosis. When Karl saw her, he froze. It was the very face from his visions. He fell madly, desperately in love. He tried to save her using the most advanced and experimental methods, spending his own money on expensive equipment. But it was all in vain. In 1931, Elena passed away. Karl was heartbroken. With the family's permission, he built a lavish mausoleum for her. He visited there every night, talking to her and singing her songs. But that was not enough. 2 years later, on one dark night, Karl Tanzler did the unthinkable. He stole Elena's body from the mausoleum. He brought her home in a wheelbarrow. He laid her in his bed. But time took its toll. The body began to decay. So Karl, using his medical knowledge, started restoration. He wired the bones together. He replaced the deteriorated skin with silk soaked in wax and plaster. He filled the eye sockets with glass eyes. He fashioned a wig from her own hair that her mother had preserved. He stuffed the chest cavity with rags soaked in perfume to mask the scent. He lived with this grim mannequin for 7 years. He dressed her in gowns, tucked her in at night, and danced with her. Neighbors thought him an eccentric recluse, unaware of the dark secret his home harbored. The mystery was revealed in 1940. Elena's sister heard rumors that Carl was sleeping with a giant doll and went to him with the police. What they saw shocked them. Carl was arrested, but the statute of limitations on the charge of desecrating a grave had expired. He was declared insane and released. Elena's body was put on public display at the funeral home. Thousands of people came to see this macabre work of art. Later, she was reburied in a secret location. As for Carl, he moved and created a new doll, a lifelike replica of his fiancée. He died in 1952. He was found 3 weeks after his death, lying on the floor, embracing his last wax Elena. Carl Tanzler created his own eerie world of love and death. But the heroine of our next story lived in a world where love and death were part of her profession. She was the most famous executioner in England's history, who executed hundreds of people and died, leaving behind the legend of a woman who knew all the secrets of London's underbelly. Story number 26. Lady Executioner, Queen of the Criminal World. London, 15th century. A city of contrasts. Luxurious carriages of the aristocrats roll along the muddy streets, where the poor die of hunger. In this world, only the strongest survive. And one of the strongest was a woman named Mary Frid, better known as Moll Cutpurse or Tall Moll. She was a legend even in her lifetime. Moll is a diminutive of Mary, and Cutpurse means pickpocket. She was a pickpocket, a fence for stolen goods, a madam, and the owner of a tavern where all the London riffraff gathered. But she was no ordinary thief. Moll broke all the stereotypes of her time. She wore men's clothing, a doublet and breeches. She smoked a pipe, she cursed like a sailor and fought in duels. She was the first woman in England known to have smoked. Her audacity knew no bounds. Once, she bet with a well-known banker that she could ride a horse from Charing Cross to Shoreditch, dressed as a man. She won the wager, waving a flag and blowing a horn to entertain the crowd. Plays were written about her at the Fortune Theatre while she was still alive. The authors paid her £20 to appear on stage in men's attire after the performance to assist the actors. But the darkest part of her legend is tied to the position she was rumored to have held. In those times, executions were public spectacles. Executioners were figures despised but necessary, and it is said that Moll Cutpurse was one of them. She knew all the criminals of London. She understood their secrets, their weaknesses. When one of her clients was caught and sentenced to hanging, it was said that she was the one who slipped the noose around their neck. She did this not out of cruelty, but out of pragmatism. It was part of her power and her control over the criminal world. She died in her bed at an advanced age, wealthy and respected in certain circles. Moll Cutpurse was an anti-heroine, a woman who wrote her own rules in a world where women had none. She became a symbol of freedom, albeit a criminal one, and proved that sometimes the best way to survive is to become scarier than those around you. They say the rules govern the world of shadows, but the hero of our next story ruled the world of light. He was the keeper of a lighthouse that vanished along with 2 of his colleagues from an uninhabited island, leaving behind only strange entries in the logbook and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. This is story number 27, The Mystery of the Lighthouse That Extinguished Itself. External Hybrids, Scotland, December 1900. The Flannan Isles are 7 desolate rocks jutting out of the icy Atlantic. Sailors call them the 7 Hunters. On the largest island, Eilean Mor, stands a lighthouse. It is the only evidence of human presence in this harsh world. 3 keepers are on duty at the lighthouse: Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. They are experienced, weather-beaten men. On December 15th, the steamship Arctur, traveling from Philadelphia, passes by the islands. The captain notices that the lighthouse is not lit. This is a serious violation. He reports it upon arriving at port, but due to a storm, the rescue vessel Hesperus can only reach the island 11 days later. On December 26th, Christmas Eve, Hesperus approaches Eilean Mor. Captain Joseph Moore blows the horn. There is no response. He lowers the lifeboat. The dock is deserted. The lighthouse gates and front door are locked from the inside. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, the captain's namesake, unlocks the door with his key and steps inside. A dreadful silence fills the air. In the kitchen, plates with unfinished food, salted mutton and potatoes, sit on the table. One chair is overturned, and the clock on the wall has stopped. The beds in the bedroom are unmade. The lighthouse lamp is polished and filled, ready to be lit, but there are no people around. Moore finds the logbook. The last entries send shivers down the spine. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall, the senior keeper, writes, "The wind is of a strength I have not seen in 20 years. James Ducott is very quiet. Donald MacArthur is crying." This was strange. Firstly, MacArthur was known to be a rowdy and a fighter, a man one could not imagine crying. Secondly, on that day, there was no storm in the vicinity of the islands. The weather was calm. On December 13th, the storm continues. We are all praying. On December 15th, the last entry reads, "The storm has ended. The sea is calm. God is omnipotent." And that's it. An investigation begins. Every inch of the island is searched. On the western side of the dock, they find signs of a monstrous storm. The railing is torn away. Supply boxes that were 30 meters above sea level are smashed and scattered. The official version, during the storm, which was not on the weather maps, a giant killer wave struck the dock. Two keepers, Marshall and Ducott, went out to secure the equipment. When they began to be swept away, the third, MacArthur, ran out to help them without a raincoat. His coat was left hanging on a hook and was taken away with them. But this explanation does not account for why the experienced keepers violated the main rule, never to go out all three at the same time. Why did they leave the lighthouse unattended, and why did they write about the storm 3 days before it possibly happened? Other theories, from alien abduction to the attack of a sea monster or the madness that overtook one of the keepers, remain mere speculation. The mystery of the lighthouse of Helen Moore remains unsolved. 3 men simply vanished into the fog and the roar of the ocean. The keepers disappeared. However, the hero of our next story, in contrast, appeared out of nowhere. He was a man who arrived at Tokyo Airport with a passport from a country that does not exist, leaving the entire Japanese immigration service bewildered. This is story number 28, The Passenger from a Non-Existent Country. Tokyo, Haneda International Airport. July 1954. A day like hundreds of others. Planes arrive. Passengers go through passport control. But today, the routine will be disrupted. A man of European appearance, dressed in a sturdy business suit, approaches the immigration counter. He hands the officer his passport. The officer looks at the document and frowns. The passport looks authentic. Thick paper, watermarks, stamps. But in the nationality field, it reads Taurat. The officer has never heard of such a country. He calls his superior. They look at a world map. There is no country called Taurat. The man is taken to an interrogation room. He speaks several languages, including French and a little Japanese. He is outraged. He claims that Taurat is a millennia-old state in Europe, situated between France and Spain. When shown a map and pointed at Andorra, he becomes furious. He insists that Andorra is a fabrication and that Taurat has always been in its place. His story grows detailed, bewildering the special services. His passport is filled with visas and entry stamps for Japan and other countries over the past 5 years. All of them look genuine. In his wallet is currency from several European nations. In his briefcase are documents confirming he arrived on a business trip to a large Tokyo company. Security calls this company. They confirm, yes, we are expecting this man. We have an appointment with him. The situation reaches a standstill. The Japanese decide to accommodate the mysterious passenger in a hotel room on the top floor, right near the airport, while they sort things out. 2 guards are placed at the door. The next morning, officers arrive at the room. It is empty. The window is locked from the inside. The door has been guarded all night. The only exit is from the 15th floor. No traces. The man from Taurat vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. along with all his belongings. What was that? This story, often referred to as the Man from Tarat, has become one of the most famous urban legends about time travel or parallel universes. Skeptics assert that it was likely an elaborate hoax or a story embellished over time. Perhaps it was a con artist with an extremely good forgery who managed to escape. But believers in the paranormal are convinced it was a random glitch in the Matrix, a person from a parallel reality where history diverged slightly, momentarily entered our world and was then returned. We may never know the truth. Yet the story of the man from a non-existent country remains as a reminder that our reality may not be the only one. A man from Taurida broke the boundaries of worlds, but the heroes of our next story broke the boundaries of art. They were counterfeiters who created a forgery of such quality that it was recognized as more perfect than the original, collapsing the economy of an entire country. This is story number 29, The Con Artist Who Printed Real Money. Lisbon, 1924. Portugal is experiencing an economic crisis, inflation, poverty, political instability. In this murky stream swims a fish named Arthur Alves dos Reis. He is not just a fraudster, he is an artist, a genius whose scheme is still studied in economic universities as an example of financial surrealism. The plan that hatched in his mind was devilishly simple and audaciously bold. He was not going to counterfeit money, he intended to print it. Officially, Reis forged a contract. Not just any contract, but a secret agreement supposedly on behalf of the Bank of Portugal. The document stated that the government entrusted him, as a secret agent, to print a huge number of 500 escudo banknotes for financial assistance to the Portuguese colony of Angola. The operation was, of course, highly classified. Armed with this contract, complete with forged signatures and seals, Reis went to London to the company Waterloo & Sons. This was the very printing house that produced real Portuguese escudos commissioned by their government. Sir William, the director of Waterloo, was initially skeptical, but the documents looked flawless. Reis was charming and persuasive. In the end, greed prevailed. The printing house agreed to fulfill the secret government order. They printed for Reis 200,000 banknotes of 500 escudos each. This was an astronomical sum, nearly 1% of Portugal's GDP. And most importantly, these were not counterfeits. They were printed on the same machines, with the same paper, using the same inks from the same plates as the official currency. It was impossible to tell them apart. Moreover, some of these notes had serial numbers that were already in circulation, but this was common practice due to printing defects. Reis and his accomplices began to import the money into Portugal. They opened their own bank, the Bank of Angola and the Metropolis, to launder the money by offering cheap loans and investing in industry. For a time, Reis became a national hero. He injected enormous sums into the economy, creating jobs. The country began to emerge from the crisis. Nobody knew that this economic boom was an illusion built on money out of thin air. The scam was uncovered by chance. One of the bank clerks noticed that an unusually high number of brand new banknotes with identical serial numbers were arriving in his cash register. An investigation began. When the truth came to light, Portugal faced a financial collapse. Trust in the national currency was shattered. The Bank of Portugal was forced to withdraw all 500 escudo bills from circulation and replace them with new ones. Arthur Alves dos Reis was arrested. In court, he behaved like an artist, claiming he acted for the good of the country. He served 20 years and died in poverty, but his scam went down in history as the most brilliant forgery that wasn't a forgery. Reich played with economics, but the hero of our last story played with physics. He was a monk who built the world's first electric car 100 years before Elon Musk, using only faith, science, and a little sulfuric acid. This is story number 30. The monk who invented the future in a monastery cell. Hungary, Benedictine Monastery, 1828. In the silence of the cell, among ancient tomes and crucifixes, a monk named Anyos István Jedlik leaned over a strange device. This was not a prayer, it was science. Anyos Jedlik was not just a clergyman, He was a brilliant physicist and inventor. While his fellow monks recited psalms, he read the works of Volta and Faraday. His cell resembled more of an alchemist's laboratory. Everywhere were flasks, wires, magnets, and galvanic elements. That year, while experimenting with electromagnetism, he created what would later be called a dynamo. He discovered the principle of self-excitation ahead of Werner von Siemens by several years, who received all the glory. But Jedlik did not stop there. He looked at his small electric motor and asked a question that would have changed the world had it been heard. Could this be driven? He built a small carriage. On it, he mounted his electric motor, which powered the wheels and a primitive battery. This was the world's first electric car. Imagine the scene. Through the corridors of the ancient monastery, among portraits of saints, silently rolls a small, self-propelled carriage. It was 1828. It would be nearly 60 more years until Carl Benz's gasoline-powered automobile. Ányo Szedlik demonstrated his model, which he called the lightning magnetic carriage, to his students at the university where he taught. But the world was not ready. The idea was seen as a toy, an eccentric monk's whim. No one saw in this rolling carriage a prototype of the future. Jedlik did not patent his invention. He was not a businessman. He was a scientist and a servant of God, for whom exploring the world was a form of prayer. He continued his experiments, creating the world's first carbonated water on an industrial scale. But his greatest creation remained a model, 1 century ahead of its time. Only in the 21st century, when the world was swept by an electric car craze, did science historians recall the humble Hungarian monk. His small carriage, housed in a museum in Budapest, is a silent reproach to humanity that could have been driving on clean energy 100 years earlier had it listened to the genius of Jedlik. And now, the last folder of this cycle is closed. We laughed at Sam's war, admired the audacity of the man who sold the tower, shuddered in horror listening to the tale of the dancing plague, and marveled at the genius of the monk who built the electric car. These stories are not just amusing facts. They are a mirror reflecting the strangest, most unpredictable, and astonishing thing in the universe: human nature. The ability to dream, to make mistakes, to take risks, to create, and sometimes to act in ways that defy any boundaries. The archive slips back into the shadows. But remember, the most incredible stories do not always happen to kings and generals. Sometimes they occur with your neighbor, with the mail carrier, with an ordinary farmer. Just be attentive. The world is full of wonders waiting to be told. Thank you for being here.